That is Michelle.
Good morning, Michelle. Good morning, Carmiel. Good morning, Pittsburgh. We are here in the Lehman Center of Congregation Beth Shalom, right following a lovely little thunderstorm and severe flood warning. I hope nobody had any severe flooding. It's very hot in America today, but it is nice and cool in Pittsburgh and 80 degrees. We are here for Monday morning Talmud, as is our custom. We are very excited to be here. I hope you are all well. And yeah, everybody good out there in Israel? We were just kind of talking before the record button got hit, but maybe some of you want to say something for posterity's sake.
They're giving bridge parts today.
Oh yeah, I heard that. The big news in Squirrel Hill is the bridge is out, but they're bringing in the big long iron I-beams for the new bridge. So
I suppose the big news for the three of us who are here is that starting next Monday, public transportation for us is free.
Yeah. And Marion, did
Over
you check it?
65.
Marion, did you check into the Kihila WhatsApp? Rivka has had emergency
yes.
surgery.
Yes, I did. I saw that.
Well, when
But
Dina called me because she should be at book club here, and she called me to tell me what had happened and also that. So
Yeah,
I put it on and it's.
I'll
gonna
call
happen.
Nina as soon as we finish here.
Great.
Yeah.
Keeping in touch, yeah.
great. It is great to see you all. Let's get started. We are on page 32b, line 23. If you're scoring at home in the Sefaria text, here in our Beit Midrash, we just projected on the wall. If anybody ever complains and wants paper, I will take care of it. But so far, everyone's been very happy to not kill any trees. Also, you can always bring your own digital device and access our guest Wi-Fi and save more trees that way. So I'm just going to go back one line and read really quickly. We don't really need to review this because it was a good big finish for last time. But if anyone has any comment on it, because I don't think we really spent a whole lot of time with it, it was this long section in our Talmud that was dealing with whether the person who leads services and is blowing shofar should also be the person who does shachrit, or whether that should be the person who does musaf. And then a counter argument or a parallel, which was if there's a person who is doing Hallel for Rosh Hashanah, should they be the person who is also the shachrit or also the musaf? And then, of course, we concluded that section of the Gemara with the question, wait a minute, Hallel for Rosh Hashanah, what's going on here? Well, we don't do Hallel on Rosh Hashanah. And so our Talmud concludes with this. Midikamar bishat Hallel, miklal de Rosh Hashanah leka Hallel, which is clear as day, everybody, right? It says right there in the Aramaic. But actually, this is a good opportunity to do a Jeremy Marquis check for understanding Talmud moment. This is a little more technical than you probably need. I will throw it into the chat because I think it is worth saving for posterity's sake. If I can find where there you pull up the chat. So in Hebrew, in Aram, so let's do it in Hebrew. In Hebrew, there are, and the Israelis really know this, there is a specific term that's not exactly a verb in Hebrew. It functions in kind of this weird space. When you want to say, I have, or you want to say there is, you just say two little Hebrew letters. Yesh. There is, right? So that's there is. And then in Hebrew, the opposite of it is
Ein.
Ein, right? Yesh and ein. There is, there ain't. Okay. Ain't is a much better translation for ein than there is not, for an obvious reason, which is it sounds alike, right? Ain't and ein are very memorable. And also there's fewer words, right? So there is and there ain't. Aramaic has the exact same construction. There's only one tricky thing about it, which is it's got some it doesn't quite perfectly mirror the Hebrew. So in Aramaic, if you want to say there is, you say, anyone know this? No? Ika.
Oh, great.
Ika. Ika is there is. Okay. Ika is yesh. All right. Now, I don't imagine that you'll memorize this, but if we do it enough times, it'll kind of ring a bell. And it also, there's kind of an antonym homonym sounding kind of thing for the opposite. The opposite of it is, we just had it, Leica. By the way, one of the great talents I have as a rabbi is being able to type in Hebrew, right? Like I just forced myself to learn how to type in Hebrew. I would say 2/3 of my rabbinic colleagues can't type in Hebrew, or they because that's maybe not 2/3, maybe it's less than that. But a lot of my colleagues can't type in Hebrew, and so if you think like Rabbi Goodman is not a very good rabbi, that is true, but I can type in Hebrew. Okay. But anyways, it was a really useful skill, and I forced myself to learn my 3rd year of rabbinical school. So Ika is there is, and Leica is there is not. So for those of you who are keeping a Talmud notebook, now you have all that for posterity. So when it says Miklal de Rosh Hashanah Leica Hallel, you all know what that says. On Rosh Hashanah, or Miklal in general, or from the fact, or by inference is the way they translate it here. De be Rosh Hashanah, on Rosh Hashanah, Leica Hallel. There is no Hallel, right? Clear as day. My time, what's the reason? Rabbi Abahu says, Amru Malakei Hasharet Lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ribono Shel Olam Mipnei Ma Ein Yisrael Omrim Shira Lifanecha Rosh Hashanah Uba Yom Kippurim, right? And so Rabbi Abahu tells a story. The ministering angels, I love that. Malachei Hasharet. Where do we know the phrase Malachei Hasharet from? It's in Shalom Aleichem. How many times does it appear in Shalom Aleichem? No. Cindy got it. It's a trick question. Shalom Aleichem, Malachei Hasharet, Malachei Elyon, Mi Melech Malachei Hama. Boachem l'Shalom, Malachei Hashalom. Not Malachei Hasharet, Malachei Hashalom. Why? I have no idea, but it's this mysterious thing that in the song that we sing at when we sit down at our Shabbat tables, we invoke the Malachei Hasharet, the ministering angels, once, but then from then on we call them Malachei Hashalom. We call them the angels of peace. Maybe once they've come in, we don't expect them to minister because it's Shabbat and they're like they shouldn't be working. They're now Malachei Hashalom. They should be shaloming, blah blah. Okay. So anyways, the angels turn to God and say, hey, yo, God, every other holiday, the Jews line up and they do this thing called Hallel, and they ain't doing no Hallel. Why ain't they doing no Hallel? Amar Lahem, right? Which implies, I think, God. The Kadosh Baruch Hu, specifically. Not God, but the Kadosh Baruch Hu. Efshar Melech Yoshev al Kisei Din, v'sifrei Chaim, v'sifrei Meitim potchim lefanav, v'Yisrael omrim shira, right? You would think, could it be that the king should sit on his or her throne and with the book of life and the book of death open before the king or queen, and the Israelites would say songs of praise, right? And so it's a theological moment. It doesn't feel to Rabbi Abahu appropriate that while life and death matters are being discussed, they should sing Hallel. Now, there are, I think, a couple reasons for this, but I want to ask you, what do you think of this? Why do you think of this? Do you think this makes sense? Yeah. Elisheva, go ahead, and then Cindy.
I just think if God is sitting on God's throne and judging us, to sing Hallel would sound like bribery.
Right.
It wouldn't reflect well on us.
Right. In the principle of when we think about tefillah, one of the things we've talked about here is there's an old idea that all of Jewish prayer fits into 3 neat categories. I don't believe that's true, but that it all fits into 3 categories, right? Petition, praise, and thanks, right? So this is supposed to be praise, right? And the problem with praise is if you butter up God, hoping you'll get better results, right? Like weekday, maybe that's okay because we do it as a standard on weekday and Shabbat, but maybe this Hallel thing is excessive and it's too much. Okay, Cindy, you wanted to say?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, it takes away from focus.
it
Right.
takes away from what focus?
Well, so on Rosh Hashanah, if we're supposed to be paying attention to this idea that the book of life is open and we are being judged, then, if we're busy like singing praises, it takes away from the focus on that, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Right?
yeah. So perhaps, and I think that that's actually in terms of if you were thinking like a liturgist, like a person who was writing this out, that's a bigger and smarter idea, which is like, what are the ideas and themes that I want to do in this holiday, and does Hallel fit with that? So, and I've said this many times before in this class, but it's worth repeating. There's a great debate between typically the Ashkenazi and Sephardi understandings of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. One thinks Rosh Hashanah is the serious holiday and that Yom Kippur is the happy holiday. And the other community thinks it's the other way around, right? So in the Sephardic tradition, Rosh Hashanah is Yom Hadin, and it's a very serious day, and Yom Kippur is a happy day because we're cleansed, we're forgiven. And for Ashkenazim, the theory is reversed. Rosh Hashanah is Yom Harat Olam; it's the day of the creation of the world, and Yom Kippur is a very serious day because who shall live and who shall die, right?
Wow.
So I think that the idea fits here neatly also, which is like, is Hallel joyous? And is a joyous prayer, too joyous for a serious day, right? It's a good question. Any other comments before we kind of move on? Yeah, go ahead, Marion.
Yeah, I think being serious doesn't preclude being happy.
Right. Yeah. Right. When I watch a good movie that makes me cry 3 or 4 times, I am also happy, right? I just watched something great. I don't know if you can get it in Israel, but in the US, it's called The Bear. May not hit all of you great, but it is a really good series on Hulu and FX. It's just 8 episodes long. It's about a guy who takes over a restaurant for his brother who passes away. And it's very intense and chaotic and very emotional and very thoughtful and sometimes funny. The only challenge, of course, I always find it difficult as a rabbi, not really, to recommend something that uses prodigious amounts of the F word, right? But then again, I use prodigious amounts of the F word when I'm not in synagogue. So no, I don't. I would never do. Not around my kids and not around.
It's a verb, it's a noun.
Right.
It's
Paul is of the belief that it's very useful. Now, we have a caterer, food service events person here who is the sweetest little old Catholic lady who's been working here for, no joke, 52 years. And she is so kind. Michelle looks like a youngin', but well, she's been working here for 52 years.
But she
50
started as a teenager.
I know, that's true. She started as like 17. But she's the most kind, wonderful, one of my favorite people in the world. But if you just tip her off that swearing in front of you is okay, she swears like a sailor. It's fantastic. I love it. Anyway, I just outed her. See, if you hang out in my Talmud class, you get to know the dirt. Any other thoughts before we move along to our next Mishnah? Great. We're moving on. With that, Elisheva, you're the first window in Circle Gets a Square. So we're on line 23. I'll do the Hebrew. Since it's the Mishnah, it's all Hebrew. You will do the English, and I'll scroll down so you can see it. Matnitin, our Mishnah. Shofar shel Rosh Hashanah, ein mavirin alav et hatchum, ve'ein mafkichin alav et hagal. Lo olin ba'ilan, velo rochvin al gabe behema, velo shatin al pnei hamayim, ve'ein chotchin oto, bein b'davar shehu mishum shvut, ubein davar shehu mishum lo taseh. Aval, im ratza liten latocha maim o yain yiten.
Mishnah, with regard to the shofar of Rosh Hashanah, one may not pass the Shabbat limit for it, that is, to go and hear it, nor may one clear a pile of rubble to uncover a buried shofar. One may not climb a tree, nor may one ride on an animal, nor may one swim in water, in order to find a shofar to sound. That presents some very amusing pictures. And one may not cut the shofar to prepare it for use, neither with an object that is prohibited due to a rabbinic decree, nor with an object that may not be used due to a prohibition by Torah law. However, if one wishes to place water or wine into the shofar on Rosh Hashanah so that it emits a clear sound, he may place it, as this does not constitute prohibited labor.
Right. Okay. So remember that the bold lines are the literal and the non-bolded lines are Rashi / Steinsaltz clarifying. Mostly that's important for the last idea, which is the water or wine idea. Because I think there's the alternative, which is, as we all know from watching things like Game of Thrones or reading Lord of the Rings, or just knowing kind of medieval or Viking history, horns were also vessels for drinking, right? There's a reason that the cornucopia is a horn, right? That they were a carrying device for food and drink because they were convenient for such a matter. So the fact that it says the shofar, you put water or wine into it so it emits a clear sound, I would say is not the obvious reason, right? You might think that it's related to, I think, the carrying. So there's a bunch of rules here, and they're about shofar. I want to skip to what this jogged in my mind, which is one of my favorite texts that I learn as a high school teacher, because it's very visceral and kids can do fun projects with it, which is, and you know, I created this and I thought I was so smart. And then I went to like a convention and I talked to a bunch of other educators and I was like, oh yeah, the thing where you build a sukkah with your kids after you learn the Mishnah Sukkot. And I was like, I thought I invented that. But what I actually, what I evolved that program eventually. So you take the Mishnahs on Sukkot and you teach the kids, you give them I would give them a slip of paper and they would have to build one of these kind of oddball sukkahs. And then after a couple of years of doing it the regular way, I realized there was a more fun and more challenging way to do it and a better way, because one of the challenges you have as a day school teacher is once you make a project, you either display it in the classroom and then you got a bunch of crap hanging around the classroom for weeks and months and it looks schwach, or you give it to the kids to take home and then they have to dump it in the garbage at some point, right? Or they dump it in the garbage right in front of you and break your little heart. So what I came up with was I created the project in my second and third year of teaching, but they had to be edible, which was super fun because kids would bring in sukkahs, 2 or 3 a day, and then they would present for 20 minutes or 15 minutes, and then we would eat them, right? Which was really, really fun. And then the kid, but so it was also a punishment for the kid who made their sukkah out of dry spaghetti and mint leaves. It's like, nobody wants to eat that, right? Where's my gummy worm sukkah? I want the gummy worm sukkah. So, and kids got really good making basically gingerbread sukkahs, which was awesome. Because I also think, you know, Jews suffer at Christmas from not being able to do the fun Christmas stuff, like making a gingerbread house. So gingerbread sukkahs. Anyways, okay. So in Mishnah Sukkot 2:3, we get similar things, right? Haose Sukkatoba Rosh Hagalah Ubo Rosh Hasvina Kasher or Kashera, but only La B'Yom Tov. Okay. In case of one who establishes his sukkah on top of a wagon or on top of a ship, it is fit, and one may ascend it on a festival day. In the case of one who establishes his sukkah at the top of a tree or atop a camel, the sukkah is fit, but one may not ascend it on the first festival day because the sages prohibit climbing or using trees or animals on the festival. Yada, 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 yada. Okay, if you keep going to the next one, you get Hose Sukkato Bein Ha'ilanot, Va'ilan Dafnot. No, that's not the one I want. Where's the one on a boat? There's one on a boat somewhere around here. Anyways, nonetheless, there's a whole thing about making one in a tree or on a wagon or on a camel or on a boat. And so that is all I wanted to share with you. that is a nice parallel to our text in Rosh Hashanah, in which we learn that you may not climb a tree, or you may not ride an animal like a camel, or you may not swim in water in order to get your shofar and sound it. All right, Renee has a question. Go ahead, Renee.
It's not a question. It's actually, when I raised my kids in White Oak at Camillus Hesed, we would do what we called a sukkah tour. And we would take the kids in a couple of cars and go around to each sukkah, and each sukkah had something for them. They could eat there. They also took candy home, or fruit or juice. And, that was sort of the White Oak or the Camillus Hesed Halloween, since the Orthodox don't do Halloween. Okay. And really you're not supposed to anyway, but give that whatever you want. That was what we used to do.
Yep.
And the kids loved going on it and seeing the different sukkahs, and that made it important for how did the kids decorate the sukkah as well, because they wanted to be proud of it.
Our youth group does it too. It's called the Sukkah Hop. We have one also. The day school does one, and it's a progressive sukkah mealy thingy. Or is that the one that we do as a synagogue?
I've never heard community day school doing that.
Yeah, I think we do that as a synagogue. The youth group does it. The adults do it. It's a thing. We'll do more of it. You can join in, Renee.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Cool. So let's go back. Any other comments or thoughts about this? The basic understanding, of course, is that carrying on Yontav and Shabbat is not permitted, but carrying on Yontav is permitted, but they're not allowed to carry beyond the tchum. But digging is one of the forbidden 39 categories of labor. Climbing a tree is forbidden for some fairly for rabbinic reasons that are a fence around a fence. If I told you exactly why, you would laugh. The reason, according to the Talmud, of why you can't climb trees is because you may break off a branch. Now, there's nothing technically wrong with breaking off a branch. That's funny, except that there is a further issue that one may use the branch as a switch to strike one's animal, which one is riding on Shabbat, which they're not allowed to do. Now, that sounds absurd, but that is exactly the reason why the rabbis forbade climbing a tree on Shabbat. I think there's a bigger reason there that they're talking about, though, which is, and this is very Hishalian of me, because we're asking the question of like, what's the philosophy behind it? And the answer is, we like walking through nature on Shabbat, but interacting with nature in such a way that it is changed is not something we are supposed to do. So as much as I love walking, I like picking the weeds in my garden. I like picking the weeds in my garden. I like harvesting the fruit from my garden. I like, mowing my lawn as a cathartic, restful activity. I don't do any of those things on Shabbat, because one of the things I remind myself over and over again on Shabbat and Yom Tov is God created the universe to be exactly like this, and I'm supposed to leave it alone, right? Even on Shabbat, when I've said this before, even on Shabbat, when I see garbage on the street, I am tempted to pick it up because this is the way I am. But I remind myself as I pass by the garbage on my walk home from shul, God has intended that that garbage be here because the universe is perfect right now, and it does not need me to improve it or fix it. That's a very healthy thing to believe as part of your Shabbat philosophy, because otherwise you believe that the universe needs you to do stuff in order for it to be more perfect. Now, I will be honest, I am a rabbi at a synagogue. Obviously, I have to do stuff on Shabbat, right? If I didn't do stuff on Shabbat, the rest of you would have to do more stuff on Shabbat, and you'd have to work.
Let's get started. Drive safely.
Uh-oh, somebody's talking to Alexa or something like that. Okay, anyways, with that, we have two hands up, Marion and then Rav Judy.
Yeah, I was just thinking what you said about breaking off a branch in a tree reminds me that is a thing that you're not supposed to sweep in case you break the the straw of the broom and attempted to fix it.
Yeah, I just use a vacuum. That
Yes.
that solves the problem.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think yeah, cleaning on Shabbat is always a challenge. Of course, in the ultra Orthodox community, they don't believe that you can squeeze a sponge because that they believe that the creation of bubbles is a violation, which interestingly led the Orthodox community to do something that I became fond of, which is going back 20 and 30 years, they would use bristle brushes, which don't create bubbles. And there's a special kind of hmmm soap that doesn't create bubbles. And I found out very quickly that sponges smell and bristle brushes don't. And I gave up my sponges like 20 years ago. And I was like, oh, this is a brilliant innovation by the ultra Orthodox community. Okay, go ahead, Rav Judy.
Okay, sponges, you put them in the dishwasher every time you run the dishwasher and they're fine. That's just, and bristle brushes, yes, an oldie but goodie. But that's not what I wanted to ask. Two things. I know that very observant people will go to their rabbi to get special permission to swim on Shabbat. So swimming on Shabbat is forbidden, basically, if you're very observant. Okay, the other thing is, what about climbing the tree because the bird and the nest and the eggs and all that that's in the Talmud? What about that?
Right. So
what about saying, or I don't even remember, but I'm remembering birds, eggs.
Yeah, it's a good one. So I'll answer both of them. The first one is swimming on Shabbat and Yontif is problematic for a variety of reasons in the religious community. Now remember, when the Talmud and the Mishnah talk about swimming, they're obviously talking about a natural body of water, right? Fancy pools did not exist. So when you're swimming in a river or a lake, there are at least two challenges to it. One is if the river carries you away, you're putting yourself in physical danger. And two, in the ancient world and even to this day, swimming is slightly dangerous, right? And so you have to have floaties or a lifeguard or a parent on duty. And so the halachic problem of swimming, like probably most first and foremost, is placing yourself in danger such that someone else needs to carry you and risk their life on Shabbat is problematic. The second problem with swimming is that that's the main problem of swimming, other than the fact that it's kind of expressly forbidden. The main other problem of swimming, I know from the modern world, is you got to put sunscreen on if you're going to get into the water, and sunscreen is considered a lotion, and applying lotions and perfumes to yourself on Shabbat is also one of the 39 forbidden categories. So many people, I know of a family friend who had to ask dispensation from his rabbi as to whether he could go swimming in a pool and put sunscreen on his kids. And some rabbis will permit sunscreen on Shabbat and others will not in the observant world. I think
agree with what Olivia just said.
So
I
do
think
I.
I think swimming is
Big
fine.
laugh,
I think
okay.
sunscreen is fine. So you don't need my permission to go swimming. Olivia says it's pikuach nefesh. I would agree 100%, but I also think there's no problem that, like, you saw my answers, my explanations of why swimming may be forbidden. The other main concern, the other main concerns of swimming on Shabbat are regarding carrying and regarding going past the tchum, because remember, like, there's no eruv for a body of water. Like, once you get into a body of water, you're traveling in a public domain, which might automatically be a violation of Shabbat. So there are multiple problems with swimming on Shabbat. So I don't know. Anyways, but I don't think, but by the way, it is not a deoraita isur, meaning of the 39 categories of things that are forbidden on Shabbat, swimming is not one of them, right? So if you need to say swimming is forbidden on Shabbat, it is a rabbinic fence that was added. Now, I'm only really strict on the 39 d'oraita, right? It's one of the reasons why electricity really doesn't bother me on Shabbat at all, right? Because electricity is not making a fire. And the only rabbis who ever argued it were arguing that in like the early 1900s. And if you read the first tshuvot on I've read them. The first tshuvot by rabbis in the 1890s and 1900s about electricity and Shabbat, they do not know what they're talking about. Like they literally are describing like, well, you're making a fire by flipping on the switch. And you're like, no, you're not. You have no understanding of what's going on. Modern rabbis have made arguments about why when you turn on the electricity, you may be somewhere off down the way requiring someone at a plant to put, coal into a burner, but like that's not how they originally forbade it. So, all right. Joe had his hand up an hour and a half ago, followed by Marion, followed by Judy. Go ahead, Joe.
So we'll see who remembers this discussion. So long ago, in the very beginning of the conversation, when we were only 5 or 6 people, we discussed the high holy days, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and which one was sad and which one was joyous. And we breezed right over that in almost seconds, no time at all. And then we got into this big, long discussion about bubbles and lotion and sponges. And I'm wondering, which of these things should we really be focusing on?
Right.
And this is the beauty of Judaism. And
We wonder.
Yeah.
I'll leave it at that.
No, it's a beautiful sentiment. The idea that, the Talmud and the Mishnah are focused on a legalistic approach to Jewish law in which you observe, and by your following the strictures of the law, you're clearly demonstrating that. The interesting thing is, and I think it's great, by the way, to do class this way. This class was very kind of counterintuitive in the sense that like we started where we ended last week, which is this very big theological idea that the Gemara presents. We rip through it quickly, and then we move on to a dull legalistic issue about climbing trees, right? From the sacred to the mundane, as Joe would be saying. And I think that that's a good thing in this class. I think another class would say, let's stay on topic. Let's make sure the themes and the ideas all flow together. In a traditional Talmud class, which is what this is, you just keep going until you run out of time. And then that's it. Like you don't, I know there are Talmud teachers who teach it a different way, who would say, I know exactly which parts of the Gemara we're going to get to today. But this class, because it's open-ended, it's 52 weeks of the year and it just keeps going. I never really think like, how far are we going to get? Where am I going to stop? Like, by the way, I prepare about a quarter to a half a page a day, and then I never get to all of it, which is great. Sometimes we get to as far as I get, but usually not. All right, Marianne, then Judy, then Erica.
Okay, 2 things. First of all, in the prohibition about swimming in water in a lake, for example, do they ever consider the fish that is disturbing the life in the water? Is that part of it? And along that kind of a line, sunscreen, yeah, actually, I need it because I have very sensitive skin and so forth. I use it all the time. But actually, the commercial sunscreens pollute the water.
Interesting.
Some of them do, right?
Some of them, says Cindy. I have never seen anything about disturbing the fish, and I will repeat again, you should all wear sunscreen. Also, very large hats. I have a very large hat when I'm out in the sun.
Yeah.
I am very fair-skinned, and everyone in my family has had skin cancer. So I am, and you can kind of see my nose is still a little bit red because I was out in the sun the other day, because my hat covers all of my head except my nose. And I put sunscreen on it, and it doesn't matter anyway. So, okay, Judy and then Erica. Nobody cares about my nose.
we care about your nose. Okay, first of all, we never talked about the bird, the nest, the
Let me
egg.
answer that really quick, if that's okay, and then you'll finish.
Okay, good.
That has nothing to do with Yontif and Shabbat, but there is a mitzvah in the Torah that the Talmud talks about a little bit, about what's called shiluach haken, which is the shooing away of the mother bird, that it is a very, a big mitzvah when one climbs a tree to get eggs, that one should not kill the mother bird and take the eggs. It's kind of a sign of chesed, of loving kindness. And it's a very parallel mitzvah to the idea of not boiling a calf in its mother's milk, which is basically like, don't be a chazer, don't be greedy and take both the chicken and the eggs, right? Be one or the other. Go ahead, Judy.
Okay, so then that makes total sense, and therefore there's no reason to climb the tree, because that's like harvesting. You're harvesting the eggs. Yeah. Okay. So what about since the rabbis at that time didn't know about private swimming pools? What if you have a swimming pool? No, this is a serious question.
Yeah.
What if you have your own swimming pool in your own house? In other words, it's part of your property.
Yeah.
And you're Orthodox. You're from. Can't you go in that? Not disturbing nature. You're not going beyond the eruv. You're not carrying, because you can carry within your house.
So there's one other problem that I forgot, which is bathing.
Oh.
Bathing. So in the frum world, you don't bathe on Shabbat.
So going for a swim in your own pool is like bathing.
Right. So they have but also I'm going to add, bathing is not one of the 39 categories. And it's very, there's a section in Mishnah Yoma, the one for Yom Kippur, that, because you all know probably that bathing is forbidden on Yom Kippur, that the rabbis get into the question like, well, what if you smell bad or what if you get mud on your legs and it makes you feel really uncomfortable? So the rabbis explain that you can wash your hands, you can wash your face, you can wash your feet. You just can't, it sounds like the hokey pokey, but you just can't do it all at once. You can put your left hand in, you can put your left hand out, you can put your left hand in, but you cannot put your whole self in, your whole self out, your whole self in, right? And so that's the other problem, which is immersing your entire self on Shabbat or on Yom Kippur is forbidden. Go ahead.
Would men and women even swim together, though?
I was going to ask, if you have a pool in your yard and you're Orthodox, do you Mondays and then can swim on Tuesdays?
This is the joke of it could lead to mixed dancing, right? The question is raised about whether men and women swimming together is a problem. By the way, like all that stuff is modern. There is nothing in the Talmud or in the Mishnah about women and men swimming together. I think, by the way, that there is also, and you may not know this because it's not often raised, but archaeological remnants of synagogues in Israel have found very clear evidence that there was no such thing as a women's section in synagogues in Israel in the Mishnaic and Talmudic period. And many archaeologists and anthropologists have concluded that a divided synagogue where men and women sit separate is a medieval or post-medieval innovation, right? There is no evidence that in the time that we're reading from right now. Now, by the way, no Orthodox rabbi would ever say that out loud for two reasons. One, they don't read anthropological and archaeological journals. And two, it flies in the face of what they know. And in general, in the Orthodox world, they project backwards. Whatever we're doing now is what they were doing back then, which is why one of those wonderful things that you'll find occasionally is an oil painting of the Jews at Mount Sinai. And of course, they're wearing black hats and black jackets. Right? I have seen this before, where it's like, they're all these frum men, they're all white, they all look like they came right out of the shtetl, and they've all got beards. And it's like, dude, no, that's not what Sinai looked like. Okay, anyways. But I just want to say, It's really important as for us to kind of think about that Judaism does not evolve along some magical continuum where everything was firmer back then and everything looked like it did back then. We just don't know what it looked like back then. And sometimes it looks like what life looks like now, and sometimes it does not. Okay, Erica, Marion, Olivia, eventually we'll move beyond the one text that we've done for today. I promise.
All right, so I have to say that, of course, Judaism looked nothing back then like it does today. How could it? I mean, we don't anyway. I mean, take any number of things that how people lived back then. Yes, they ate. Okay, we eat. But anyway, I won't even go there. But I will say, much like your previous quote, that I always said that it doesn't for Pesach it prohibits all these grains. It doesn't say anything about shrimp. So, I could eat shrimp on Pesach, right? Because it doesn't say you can't. Anyway, that's I guess you're vacuuming. So, and as to the no such thing as the women's section, when I first got to Europe, I was shocked that all the synagogues, even the Reformed synagogue in Berlin, on the Pesalotistrasse, which is very famous, the men and women the women sit separate. And it really bugged me. So I started where is it written that we have to do this? It's not actually in the Shulchan Aruch. I read that thing from literally cover to cover, trying to find where it says it. It doesn't say that. So that's why it makes sense to me what you're saying, that there's no evidence of that, because it's not an actual prohibition that men and women can't sit sit next to each other or whatever it is. So I don't, I guess you said it came up sometime in the medieval times. I'm sure whatever it did, but it certainly was not a thing. It's not Jewish law. It's purely minchag. So I remember asking a rabbi about it. They got very offended. Well, but that's the custom. That's how but it doesn't. But so wherever that came from, I don't know. And I came late. I apologize. So I'm not sure if you covered this, but I'm just looking at the text with the shofar on Shabbat. But why would you even be cleaning your shofar on Shabbat? You don't have to play. You can't blow it on Shabbat. So why would you leave it until
So
after Havdalah to clean it if you desperately so? And why would we even need to clean it on Shabbat? Because you would
right. So just one thing that's really interesting. It's so it says shofar shel Rosh Hashanah ein mavirin alav et hatchum, and then the comment is you pass the Shabbat limit. But the interesting thing is, we are probably not talking about Shabbat. We are probably talking about on Rosh Hashanah, right? But it's probably both. Now, the rules of Rosh Hashanah are slightly less than the rules of Shabbat, but the rules are almost identical. So the question is probably about Rosh Hashanah. It is confusing, but remember that the word Shabbat is actually not explicitly in the text. It's an insertion by Rashi. So, but the tchum is the boundary. That's the Hebrew word for the boundary. And the boundary for Shabbat and the boundary for Yom Tov are the same boundary, right? They're because the rules are almost identical. So why the question still stands? Why would you be cleaning your shofar on this day? It's a good question. Why would you be putting water into your shofar on this day? Why would you be climbing a tree specifically to get a shofar? Why would you be riding an animal specifically to get a shofar? All of it's kind of weird, and all of it is kind of backwardsly related to the last section that we did at the very beginning a couple weeks ago, maybe even months ago, of the permission to blowing shofar when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbat, which is, so all of these things are things that like riding an animal. So let's say, I'm at Beth Shalom and the only shofar in the community, and it's Rosh Hashanah, and the only shofar in community is back at my house on South Carson Street, right on the other side of the river. And the only way to get there would be to drive over there or to ride my camel, let's say, and then ride back for to bring the shofar. The question, I think, is on Rosh Hashanah, would that be permitted, right? If the only shofar in town is a camel's ride away, am I allowed to do that? The answer implies that I may not do that. But by the way, we're still in the place where we're looking at the thin lines. In order to find a shofar to sound is an insertion. So we're assuming that that's the reason, because otherwise the understanding of this is we're talking about shofar and we're talking about riding animals. And therefore the conclusion that I would derive from this is we're talking about not riding an animal on Rosh Hashanah. Now, the other problem with that is, of course, we already kind of know you can't ride an animal on Rosh Hashanah, but they're kind of juxtaposing two possible mitzvot, right? The idea of the mitzvah of blowing shofar and the mitzvah of blowing shofar and not riding on Yom Tov and Shabbat. A little confusing, but and we're also getting into the position where, you know, it could go, you could argue that either way. So okay, Mary, and then Olivia, and then maybe Cindy.
Okay, well, two things regarding to the Orthodox. First of all, I think you can't generalize. There are a lot of modern Orthodox rabbis who would agree with you. They're very close to conservative Judaism. And so they're not all strict about things. But on the other end of the spectrum, you have the ultra-Orthodox who have gone to such extremes that they won't allow a picture of a woman anywhere, even in a school book, on a poster, anything at all.
Or a newspaper.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I definitely, I never want to speak blanketly for movements that I'm not a part of. I barely am allowed to speak blanketly about the movement that I am a part of. But I grew up with one of my close friends, Eliana Yolkut, Rabbi Eliana Yolkut, grew up in St. Louis. And in her time in St. Louis, the part of the Orthodox community that she found herself moved further and further to the right. And she and her parents, who I'm friendly with, said to me, you know, when she started rabbinical school, the orthodoxy that I grew up in no longer exists. Ooh. And there are really, there are still leftist camps of orthodoxy that have developed and kind of moved backwards or forwards, but like that development of the Orthodox community moving in a certain direction is one that I have been told is kind of a thing. Here in Pittsburgh, we have that in a big way. When I moved here, I was surprised that there isn't really much of a leftist Orthodox community. In fact, a number of our friends here at Beth Shalom are what I would refer to as formerly leftist Orthodox people who Beth Shalom is a much better fit for them than any of the mainstream Orthodox synagogues, just because there's just nothing, there isn't a leftist kind of open Orthodox or progressive pluralistic partnership orthodoxy here in Pittsburgh. I have yet to meet anyone who actually goes there, so that'll be interesting. Okay. Oh, Zarky goes. Okay. I'll ask Zarky. I see him here all the time now. All right. Olivia, go ahead, and then we're gonna try and do one more Mishnah.
Groovy. Boker Tov Shavuot Tov. I am thinking about the connection between the art that people make and their perspective on actual history. Thinking about how, like in Renaissance art classes, the Christian painters who made paintings of biblical figures would paint those biblical figures in the clothing of their contemporary era. And I don't think that's because they thought that that's the clothing that people wore forever, but because they were making a visual way of seeing themselves in their history. Mm-hmm. I think about this in like the way that I when I tell a biblical story, the way that I have people saying phrases is certainly very colloquial to this time that I'm living in. And even Talmud does this, where Talmud imagines that people in biblical times knew phrases from the Bible to quote. So I think it's an age-old tradition.
Yep.
And not necessarily indicative of how Orthodox folks might think people dressed at the time.
I think that's what really well said. There's a fine line between representation of fact and representation of seeing yourself within the text in a way that is authentic and real. So like, you can say both at the same time that a historical depiction of Victorian England should look a certain way, and also the TV show Bridgerton, which has persons of color who would not actually have been represented in Victorian England, is also really important and representative, right? And I think like I was a big fan of the Hamilton musical when I first saw it and heard about it, even though there are folks who have a huge objection to Hamilton because the entire cast is Black and Latino, with the exception of King George, interestingly. But I think that's great. The ability to see yourself within a represented is important, but you shouldn't get confused, because, by the way, and I'm not joking, when my kids were little, my son and I were big fans of Hamilton, and we listened to it like nonstop in the car on the way to school. And then at some point, there's a line in the musical about the $5 founding father, Alexander Hamilton, right? Who's on the $5 bill? Is he on the 5? He's on the 5, right?
No, he's on
$10, the $10 founding father. That's what it is, a 10. And so at some point, I made that line to Iggy, and he said, "Take out the $10 bill." And I took out the $10 bill, and he had seen, Hamilton, and he looked at this $10 bill. He had also seen the musical and seen that George Washington, of course, in Alexander Hamilton, is portrayed by a very dark-skinned Black man. And when I took out some of these dollar bills to show them what our presidents look like, he looked at the dollar bill and he was really confused. And I said, "What's wrong?" And he said, "I thought George Washington was Black." Literally, I think he was a kindergartner or a first grader.
Oh, that's
So it's
great.
really interesting, right? Like, representation is important, but you shouldn't get confused between fact and fiction, and you have to kind of blend the conversation between art and photo reality, I would say.
All right, so you'll
Go ahead.
appreciate this. I remember when we used to belong to what's the shul up in the North Hills, Reformed shul in the North Hills, had a
Ohad.
woman rabbi. Ohad Shalom, right? So we had a woman rabbi. Sharon Henry was the rabbi, right? And I remember at one point when Sharon left, she went down. She got married, went down, ended up going down to Rhoda, and we got a new rabbi. And my daughter said to me, "Mom, can a man be a rabbi?"
That's right.
It was like a total reversal.
Yeah.
The girls had no idea
Yeah.
that rabbis could be women, could be men.
I was teaching in the Hill District, and I was the only white face on the floor whatsoever. And along comes Christmas time, and the third grade teacher's husband, very big Black guy dressed up as Santa Claus, and he's going through the building, and he's got treats for the whole school.
That's right.
And the one little kid looks at me and says, "That's not Santa. Santa Ba's white."
Right.
Whoa!
That's great.
Right. Representation matters. I love, by the way, I've heard "I didn't know men could be rabbis" line. I've heard that many times, and I think it's the greatest thing in the world. Okay, let's do another line from the Mishnah, and then we'll try and get into the Gemara. This is, by the way, you could make the argument that we have been off topic and not doing Talmud today, but I think these conversations are holy, and that is exactly what Talmud wanted. They wanted to generate more discussion about what Judaism looks like and ought to be, and all of this kind of extends from the question of swimming, right? Like, a lot of this came out of the idea of swimming and whether swimming on Shabbat should be permitted or not, and why the rabbis would kind of extend the boundaries of law so that swimming would be prohibited, and the evolution of our tradition in an authentic or inauthentic way. All right. Ein ma'akvin et hatinakot milit koa aval mit askin imahem ad sheyilmadu. V'hamit asek lo yatsa, v'hashomea min hamit asek lo yatsa. Marian, go ahead and read that.
Okay. One need not prevent children from sounding the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, despite the fact that they are not obligated in mitzvot. Rather, one occupies himself with them, encouraging and instructing them until they learn how to sound it properly. The Mishnah adds, one who acts unawares and sounds a shofar without any intention to perform the mitzvah has not fulfilled his obligation. And similarly, one who hears the shofar blast from one who acts unawares has not fulfilled his obligation.
Okay. So this is a great line because it tells us a lot about the philosophy of preparing children for mitzvot, right? When children turn 13, they're obligated because they're no longer children, they're now adults. But the question becomes like, how do you teach a kid to be a shofar blower, to put on tefillin, to engage in all of these different ritual commandments if they're not permitted to do the thing until they turn 13? And the answer is they're not forbidden from doing the thing. They have to learn to practice. And so one of the things I'm just going to add is like the Hebrew word that's used here, where it's translated as one who acts unawares, is hamit asek, which is an odd word that I did not know how to translate. And I actually waited until Steinsaltz busted it off in the English to see how he saw it. Mit asek is from the Hebrew root osek, which means to be busy or involved. Mit asek is what's called hitpa'el, and hitpa'el is the tense in Hebrew that is what's called reflexive. It's the thing that you do to yourself. You're lehit labesh, you wash yourself. You mitpalel, you pray for yourself, right? To yourself. Your mit asek implies here that you are self-involved. I understood that line when I was translating it in my own head as you're practicing, right? Because practice is the thing that you do for yourself, but not for other people. Steinsaltz and Rashi translated, I guess, differently, which is that they are acting unawares, meaning they are involved with themselves without being acting for others. So we're going to unpack all of this because this is just the Mishnah. But right now we're dealing with the question of blowing shofar, the person who cannot fulfill the obligation of blowing shofar yet, and then whether they're forbidden from blowing shofar. By the way, there is a very similar mitzvah to this, which is tefillin, right? Whether they can fulfill the mitzvah for themselves when they're before the proper age. You could argue that tefillah in general is like this, right? And then it brings in this whole kind of broader category of one who may not be obligated in a mitzvah, but is also not forbidden from that mitzvah, which is the category that women were in with tefillin for a very long time until the conservative movement decided that women were commanded in all of the time-bound commandments. So even in Orthodoxy, of course, a woman can put on tefillin. There are broad arguments within Orthodoxy about whether they ought to or ought not. All right, we're going to do a Gemara, and then we'll call it a day, just so that we can tickle our brains moving forward into the coming week. Judy Bardak, you're going to read this in the English if it's okay by you. Harav Morenu V'Rabbeinu. Gemara, my taima, shofar asehu, v'yom tov ase v'lo ta'ase, v'ein asa doche et lo ta'ase, v'ase.
The Gemara asks, wait, I'm not muted. Okay, the Gemara asks, there is a principle that a positive mitzvah overrides a negative mitzvah. With this in mind, what is the reason that one may not perform a prohibited labor on Rosh Hashanah to fulfill the positive mitzvah of sounding the shofar? The Gemara answers, sounding the shofar is a positive mitzvah, but performing prohibited labor on a festival violates both the positive mitzvah to rest and the prohibition against performing prohibited labor. And a positive mitzvah does not override both a prohibition and a positive mitzvah. Okay. I think taking a nap every day that is part of my life is a positive mitzvah. I love this.
Right, good. Okay, so the nap may not be entirely related, Judy, but I appreciate the information. Let's explain what happened here, because what the Talmud just did is something really important that may not seem that important. The Mishnah throws out some ideas about things you can't do in order to go schlep or fetch a shofar. What the Talmud did was blow that up to a broad halachic principle that may be applied across all of Jewish law for all time's sake in every manner, right? One might think that a positive commandment is so important that one must then go forth and be allowed to transgress a negative commandment in order to fulfill it, right? I may say, let's say I believe that it is forbidden to drive on Shabbat, right? Or let's just go back to the camel, which is easy. You can't ride a camel on Shabbat. I might say, if I were the rabbi of the synagogue, generally we're not allowed to ride camels on Shabbat. However, we are in a situation where the nearest shofar is a camel's ride away. We have to blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. And therefore, I'm going to ride my camel over the bridge to South Carson Street, right? And go get my shofar from my beach house on Carson Street. And then I will ride back over the bridge with the shofar and blow it for Beth Shalom so that everyone can fulfill the mitzvah of shofar. Can I do this? One might logically assume that a positive commandment that is time-bound supersedes a negative commandment. Aha, says the Gemara based on this Mishnah, you can't do that, right? You may not transgress a negative commandment in order to fulfill a positive commandment. And that is a big, broad principle that is going to be applied all the way across all Jewish law, right? There is no situation where you can, right? Like, I'm trying to think of other examples that are analogous, but they're not, nothing's really jumping to mind because my camel example is so good. But Paula wanted to say something.
Okay, so you've got a very close non-Jewish friend, and he happens to know that you forgot to bring your shofar over, and he says, hey, Rabbi, I'm going to take my camel. I'll run over to your house and get your shofar and bring it back over to you. And does he make the shofar tray?
You know the answer to that question because you know the principle.
Asked him to do it.
Right.
So
there you go. So Paula brings the example of the Shabbos Goy for your, and the principle that Paula explained very nicely is a principle within the Shabbos Goy principle, which is as long as you don't specifically ask the Shabbos Goy to do something on your behalf, it's okay. Which is why, for instance, Colin Powell was a Shabbos Goy. I don't know if you all know that. It's a lovely story. You could say to Colin Powell, may his memory be for a blessing, right? It's dark in here on Shabbat. You may not say, Colin, turn on the light, which is a really funny thing, right? You may say, the oven got turned off. You may not say, Colin, turn on the oven. By the way, I don't hold by the principles of Shabbos Goy, just because I find it, I find all of the commandments that create division or disagreement between a Jew and a non-Jew problematic. I know there are non-Jews who find being a Shabbos Goy to be a really great thing, and I think that's great. I just don't engage in it because the idea that someone else is of a different status than me and therefore can do it is something that makes me uncomfortable. We're going to end on that. I hope everyone had a good class today and enjoyed it. We're a little behind. We didn't fulfill a lot of doppage. I was like, oh, we're going to get to the bottom of the page. We did not get to the bottom of the page. We got so close to 33, but we'll wake up next week on, I think it's like August 1st or August 2nd and do the page. But a heads up, 2 weeks from hence, we're either not going to have class or I'll be in Israel. And we'll either do it from Jerusalem or from Carmiel. Hope everyone is well. Yins be well. Yins stay dry. Yins don't go over any bridges.
Can you just spend one